The last beep of the heart monitor felt like a personal insult. Sarah Jenkins didn't just hear the beep, she felt it. A high E shiver that vibrated at the base of her skull, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her life. 10:17 p.m. The end of a 12-hour shift at St. Jude's, a hospital that seemed to be held together by budget cuts, exhausted nurses, and the sheer, stubborn refusal of its staff to let people die. She pushed through the double doors, the whoosh of their pneumatic sigh signaling her release. The air in the corridor was a familiar, acrid soup of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the faint, sweet-sour smell of human sickness that no amount of ventilation could ever truly scrub away. Her feet, encased in $20 sneakers she'd bought at a discount outlet, felt less like body parts and more like two tenderized, swollen bricks. For 10 years, she had walked these linoleum halls. 10 years as an ER nurse. She had seen the city's worst and, on very rare occasions, its best. She had intubated a lawyer who'd crashed his Porsche, plugged a bullet hole in a 16-year-old kid, and held the hand of a grandmother as her heart gave its final, fluttering protest. And it all left a residue. Tonight had been a special kind of hell. A 3-car pileup on the interstate, a simultaneous wave of overdose cases from a bad batch of fentanyl, and a domestic dispute that had ended with a steak knife in a place steak knives weren't meant to go. She was depleted, not just physically tired, but scoured out, a hollowed-in-the-ribs emptiness that only a long hot shower and 10 hours of comatose sleep could even begin to refill. She was just hooking her ID badge onto her scrub pocket, her movement sluggish, when she saw the flicker of motion. An elderly woman, frail as a dried leaf, was standing at the junction of the blue line and red line, painted on the floor, her floral housecoat clutched tight. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, were wide with panic. I can't find the blue one, the woman whispered, her voice a reedy tremor. My husband. Cardiology. They said follow the blue line. Sarah sighed, the sound inaudible. She was off. Her car was waiting. Her bed was calling. Her soul was calling. She could just point. It's that way, ma'am. Just keep walking. But she couldn't. I'm Mrs. Petrov, the woman said, as if to introduce herself to the uncaring universe. Hello, Mrs. Petrov. I'm Sarah. She forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. Cardiology is on the 3rd floor. This line just takes you to the elevator. Here, let me walk you. Mrs. Petrov's hand felt like a bundle of cold twigs as it gripped Sarah's arm. They walked at a glacial pace, each of Sarah's steps a protest from her aching calves. It was 10 minutes. 10 minutes of her own time, unpaid, unclocked, and unnoticed. 10 minutes of listening to Mrs. Petrov talk about her husband's love of gardening. When they reached the correct elevator bank, Sarah pushed the call button. You take this to the 3rd floor. The nurse's station is right in front. God bless you, dear, Mrs. Petrov said, patting Sarah's arm, her eyes filling with grateful tears. You're a true angel. Just a nurse, ma'am. She was turning to leave, the small act of kindness settling like a warm stone in her hollow chest, when a dry, precise voice cut through the corridor. Ms. Jenkins. Sarah froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The smell of his cologne, a sharp, expensive, citrusy scent that had no business in a hospital, had already announced him. She turned. Mr. Davies, the hospital administrator, stood there, a vision in a charcoal gray suit so sharp it could draw blood. Davies was a man who believed a hospital should be run like a hedge fund where patient outcomes were a metric for investors and compassion was a non-billable expense. Mr. Davies. His eyes flicked from Sarah to the disappearing Mrs. Petrov and then to the large digital clock on the wall, 10:28 p.m. You clocked out at 10:17, Ms. Jenkins, he said, his voice quiet, which was always more dangerous than when he shouted. It is now 10:28. That's 11 minutes of... what shall we call it? I was walking a patient to the elevator, sir. She was lost. A patient, Davies said, tasting the word. You weren't assigned to that patient. You weren't even on duty. You were, in effect, a civilian. and a civilian loitering in a restricted area on unauthorized time. Sarah felt the familiar hot prickle of anger at the back of her neck. She's an elderly woman who was scared. It took 10 minutes. 10 minutes! He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. 10 minutes for you. 10 for another nurse. 120 nurses on staff. That's 1,200 minutes, 20 hours. 20 billable hours, Ms. Jenkins, lost to walking. We are running on a 2% margin. This isn't a charity. Your time is this hospital's money, on the clock or off. He adjusted his perfect silk tie. Be more efficient with your departures. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked away, his expensive leather shoes squeaking in protest on the linoleum. Sarah stood there, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was a civilian loitering, not an angel, not just a nurse, a liability on a spreadsheet. She pushed through the exit doors into the cool, damp night air of the parking garage. The city air was thick with exhaust and the smell of the nearby river. She fumbled her keys, her hands shaking with a cocktail of fatigue and rage. She slid into the driver's seat of her 10-year-old Honda, the cracked vinyl cold against her legs. She rested her forehead on the steering wheel, just for a second. The drive home was 30 minutes. 30 minutes of navigating the potholed, poorly lit streets of a city that, like its hospital, was crumbling. 30 minutes of decompression, of trying to scrub the day, the beeps, the smells, and the condescending, citrusy reek of Mr. Davies from her mind. All she wanted was her bed. The highway overpass was the halfway mark, a concrete ribbon suspended over a dark industrial river. It was the point where the city's frantic energy finally began to bleed away, giving way to the quiet working-class suburbs. The overpass was old, built in the 70s, and the orange sodium vapor lights cast a sickly, flickering glow on the road. Sarah had the radio off. The only sounds were the drone of her engine and the thwack-thwack of her windshield wipers, which were fighting a losing battle against a misty, persistent drizzle. She was in the right lane, her cruise control set at a cautious 55 when she saw the headlights in her rearview mirror. They were coming up fast, too fast, weaving in and out of the sparse late-night traffic. Drunk or an idiot, she thought, her hands tightening on the wheel. A second later, a second pair of lights flashing red and blue appeared behind the first. A chase. Idiots. She watched as a black sedan rocketed past her, fishtailing on the slick pavement. The police cruiser was right behind it, but the sedan, it was braking, hard. It all happened in that compressed, syrupy, slow time that marks all disasters. The black sedan, in a last-ditch, desperate move, spun its wheel, trying to block the cruiser. It was a terrible miscalculation. The police car, unable to stop, swerved to the right, its tires screaming. It clipped the back of the sedan, and the impact sent the cruiser careening directly toward the concrete median of the overpass. Sarah screamed as she saw it. There was a sound, a metallic, gut-wrenching shriek of tearing metal, a sound that was less a crash and more of a thump, a final catastrophic impact that she felt in her fillings. The cruiser hit the pylon, flipped onto its side, and slid for 20 yards, shedding metal and glass. It came to rest, a mangled heap of blue and white, not 20 yards in front of her. The black sedan, its back end crumpled, sped off into the night. Sarah slammed on her brakes, her car skidding to a stop. For a full second, there was silence, the thwack-thwack of her wipers, the pounding of her own heart in her ears. Then she saw the flicker. A small, orange tongue of flame licked up from the cruiser's engine block. No, she whispered. The training didn't ask for permission. It just took over. Her hands, acting on their own, unbuckled her, threw the car in park, and grabbed her trauma bag from the passenger seat. A bag she always carried, a habit from her first year as a paramedic. She was out of the car and running before she had made a conscious decision to move. 911! Call 911! She screamed at the one other car that had stopped, 100 yards back. The heat hit her first. It was a dry, scorching wave that felt like opening an industrial oven. The smell of gasoline was overwhelmingly, terrifyingly strong. A second police car, the one that must have been tailing, the chase, skidded to a stop behind her. A young officer, his face pale and blotchy with terror, jumped out, his gun drawn. "Ma'am," he screamed, his voice reedy and high-pitched. "Get back! Get away from the vehicle! It's gonna blow! That's an order!" His name tag read Grant. He was looking at her, but his gun was pointed vaguely at the darkness where the sedan had disappeared. Sarah ignored him. She was at the cruiser's windshield, or what was left of it. "Officer, can you hear me?" Inside, a man was slumped over the steering wheel, which was now pointed at the sky. He was unmoving. A trickle of blood ran from his hairline. "Ma'am, I am ordering you to step away," Officer Grant yelled again, his voice cracking. "He's unconscious! He's trapped!" Sarah shouted back, her ER voice cutting through the night. She ran to the driver's side door, which was now facing the sky. It was hopelessly jammed. The fire was growing, feeding on the oil and gasoline, turning from orange to a sickly chemical yellow. "Help me!" she screamed at Grant. Grant was frozen, his radio in one hand, his gun in the other, caught in a paralysis of protocol and fear. "He's useless." Sarah ran back to the windshield. She unzipped her trauma bag and pulled out her shears, heavy-duty, black-handled shears designed to cut through leather, denim, and, if necessary, bone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and slammed the metal tip of the shears against the remaining safety glass. It didn't break. It spiderwebbed. She hit it again and again, adrenaline turning her arm into a piston. Smash, smash, smash. A hole big enough. She shielded her face with her forearm and punched through the glass, clearing the shards. The heat was unbearable, a physical weight pushing against her. "Officer!" she screamed into the cockpit. "My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse. I'm getting you out!" No response. She hooked one leg onto the chassis and climbed, halfway into the burning car. The smoke was thick, acrid. It smelled of burning plastic, rubber, and something else. Something coppery. Blood. The officer was a big man. His name tag read Kincaid. His seatbelt was stretched taut, the buckle jammed against the console. "Damn it!" She could feel the flames now, just on the other side of the dashboard. The plastic was starting to melt, drooping like hot wax. "Ma'am, get out of there!" Grant was screaming, finally running toward her. "I can't. The belt is stuck." She grabbed her shears and started sawing at the thick nylon belt. "Cut, you bastard! Cut!" The smoke was so thick she was crying, not from sadness, but from the sheer chemical irritation. Her lungs were on fire. The dashboard lit up. It wasn't a whoosh like in the movies. It was a flashover, a silent, terrifying ignition. The flames, which had been in the engine block, found a new fuel source. The accelerant-soaked foam of the seats, the plastic of the console. A wave of searing heat rolled over her. It didn't hurt, not at first. It was just hot. An abstract, immense heat that seemed to press all the air out of her. She smelled her scrubs, her hair, her own skin, scorching. "No!" she screamed, a primal sound, and gave one final, desperate yank on the shears. The belt snapped. Kincaid, now free, slumped like a sack of rocks, pinning her arm. "Move!" she roared, shoving his inert bulk with her shoulder. The fire was on her. She could feel it on her arms, on her hands. The synthetic fabric of her scrubs was melting, fusing with her skin. With a final, adrenaline-fueled heave, she grabbed the back of his ballistic vest. She didn't lift. She fell. She fell backward out of the windshield, pulling his 200-pound body with her. They landed in a heap on the wet pavement, a tangle of limbs, glass, and blood. Sarah scrambled backward, crab-walking, dragging Kincaid by his collar. "Move, move, move!" 10 feet, 15. Officer Grant was there, finally, his face white. "Oh my God, oh my God!" "Drag him!" Sarah screamed. They each grabbed an arm and pulled. They were 20 feet away, 25. Whump! The world turned white. A concussion of hot air and sound slammed into her back, throwing her forward onto Kincaid's body. The cruiser was gone, replaced by a single monolithic column of fire, so bright it bleached the color from the night. For a moment, there was no sound at all, just a profound, ringing silence. Sarah pushed herself up. She was shaking. She was alive. Kincaid was alive, groaning. She looked down at her hands. They were in her lap, palms up. They didn't look like hands. They looked like two pieces of raw, glistening meat. The fabric of her sleeves was gone, melted into a black, tarry crust that ran from her wrists to her elbows. Then, and only then, the pain arrived. It came from a million miles away, a distant signal, and then it landed. a white, blinding, all-consuming fire. It was worse than the fire in the car. It was a fire in her nerves, in her blood. She opened her mouth to scream, and it was the last thing she remembered before the sickly orange lights of the overpass spun, blurred, and faded to black. The first thing she recognized was the smell, bleach and antiseptic. The second was the sound, the rhythmic electronic beep of a pulse oximeter. She was in her world, but she was on the wrong side of it. Her eyes fluttered open. The fluorescent lights of the trauma bay were a familiar, sterile glare, but now they felt like daggers in her retinas. "She's up. Vitals are stabilizing." That voice. She knew that voice. Dr. Ben Carter, her friend, her colleague, her doctor. "Ben?" she croaked. Her throat felt like it was full of sand and smoke. "Hey, Sarah." Ben's face swam into view. He was a good doctor, a kind man, but his eyes, normally full of a sardonic, seen-it-all humor, were dark with a professional pity that terrified her. "Don't try to talk. You've got some smoke inhalation, but the airway's clear. You're lucky." "Kincaid?" she whispered, the name a painful rasp. The cop." "He's in the next bay," Ben said, his hands busy checking the IV drip that was already snaked into the unburned skin of her shoulder. "Concussion, broken clavicle, a few cracked ribs. But he's alive. You saved him, Sarah. You're a damn hero." A hero. The word felt distant, meaningless. Her body was a symphony of pain, but the main orchestra was in her arms. They were on fire. "My hands," she whimpered, trying to lift them. They were wrapped in thick white bandages, immovable like two giant cotton clubs. Ben's face tightened. "We're managing the pain. We've got you on a morphine drip, but it's bad, Sarah. We're going to have to talk to a specialist. Second and third degree on both forearms. The left hand. The left hand is third degree. We're talking grafts, a long recovery." He was in doctor mode, delivering the news with a clinical detachment that was its own form of kindness. He was telling her, "This is a problem. We will fix it." But she was a nurse. She knew what third degree meant. It meant the nerve endings were gone. It meant the tissue was dead. It meant her hands, the tools of her trade, the things she used to find a vein, to comfort a patient, to work, were in ruins. A new kind of pain, sharper than the fire, lanced through her. Ben began the process of cleaning the wounds. "This is going to hurt, Sarah. I'm sorry." Even with the morphine, it was agony. The sterile saline wash, the gentle, agonizing debridement where he had to scrub away the melted fabric and dead tissue. Each touch was a fresh hell. She bit down on a roll of gauze, her body arched off the gurney, a high, thin keen escaping her throat. Her colleagues, the other nurses, were ghosts at the edge of the curtain, their faces pale, their eyes averted. They couldn't watch. It was too close. She was one of them. She was so lost in the white haze of pain that she didn't hear him approach. She smelled him, that sharp, citrusy, out-of-place cologne. "Dr. Carter, what is his status?" Ben didn't look up from his work. "Her status, Mr. Davies, is in agony. I'm trying to prevent a life-threatening infection, if you'll excuse us." "I will not." Mr. Davies pushed aside the curtain. He was a stark, dark-suited blot in the bright white room. His face was not concerned, or worried, or even angry. It was tight. The face of a man who had just discovered a catastrophic, unforeseen variable in his quarterly projections. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, as if she were a subordinate he'd caught taking a long lunch. "Mr. Davies," she gasped, the pain making her vision swim. "I have been on the phone for the last hour," he said, his voice a low, furious hum. "With our legal team, with our insurance carrier, with the LPD." "What?" Ben said, stopping his work. "She just saved a cop's life. She's a hero." Davies's eyes snapped to him. She is a liability, Dr. Carter. And you are documenting every single thing you are doing to her because this hospital will not be eating the cost of this stunt. He turned his cold, reptilian gaze back to Sarah. She was on a gurney, half naked in the worst pain of her life. "What were you thinking?" he hissed. He was burning, Sarah whispered, the tears of pain now turning into tears of confusion. "You were off duty," Davies said, as if explaining a complex formula to a child. "You were not a representative of St. Jude's. You were a civilian bystander who engaged in an incredibly reckless act outside your scope of practice and in violation of a direct order from a police officer." "She's a nurse!" Ben exploded. "She has a duty to act. She has a duty to this hospital not to get herself maimed on her own time," Davies shot back. "Do you have any idea what this does to our workman's comp policy? Our liability insurance?" She wasn't on the clock. She wasn't on hospital property. This injury is ambiguous. "Ambiguous?" Sarah said, the word a bubble of disbelief. I have burns." "Yes, you do," Davies said, his face a mask of profound administrative displeasure. "Burns you sustained as a civilian. Burns you are now bringing to your place of employment to treat. The paperwork is a nightmare I cannot even begin to describe." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "Sarah, you've been a fine nurse, but this is an act of gross misconduct. Your heroism has put this hospital in an untenable legal and financial position." Sarah just stared at him, the fog of morphine and pain pierced by the icy, unbelievable reality of his words. "Therefore," he continued, adjusting his cuffs, "pending a full board review of your unprofessional conduct, your endangerment of others, and your flagrant disregard for protocol, you are placed on immediate unpaid administrative leave." The words hung in the sterile air. Unpaid administrative leave. He had fired her. He had fired her while she was a patient in her own ER, her hands destroyed, her body in agony, for the act of saving a man's life. Ben Carter looked like he was going to hit him. "You can't be serious, Davies. You're firing her? Now?" "I am protecting this hospital," Davies said, his voice final. "Dr. Carter, continue your work. Send the bill to her private insurance, if she has any." He turned to leave. "Wait," Sarah whispered. He paused, one hand on the curtain, and looked back at her. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Sarah looked at her bandaged, useless hands. She looked at the IV line. She looked at the man who had just destroyed her life, her career, and her faith, all in the name of a budget. You're a monster," she breathed. Mr. Davies almost smiled. "No, Ms. Jenkins. I'm an administrator. A job, I might add, I am very good at." He let the curtain fall, the swish of the plastic, a final dismissive punctuation. Ben Carter stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of rage. Then his shoulders slumped. He looked at Sarah, his eyes full of a pain that was not physical. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. Just fix my hands, Ben," she whispered, as the darkness and the pain and the sheer, crushing injustice of it all finally pulled her under. The next 2 days were a blur of pain, medication, and the four walls of her small, neat apartment. Ben had pulled some strings, getting her discharged with a week's worth of high-grade painkillers and a referral to a burn specialist she couldn't possibly afford. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and her own quiet whimpers as the pain meds began to wear off. Her life had been reduced to a series of agonizing, humiliating tasks. She couldn't hold a fork. She couldn't open a bottle of water. She couldn't even use the bathroom without a complex, one-handed, excruciating effort. Her hands, swaddled in thick white gauze, were two useless, throbbing burdens. The worst part was the process of changing the bandages. Ben had shown her how, but the reality was a nightmare. She had to soak the old, crusted dressings off in a saline bath, a process that felt like dipping her arms back into the fire. The sight of the wounds, the raw, glistening pink and waxy, pearlescent white of third-degree burns, made her vomit the first time. The skin was tight, angry, and weeped a pale yellow fluid. This was her new reality. Her hands, the tools she had used to save lives, were now just two pieces of ruined flesh. She was sitting on her couch, her arms propped up on pillows, trying to balance a plastic cup of water on her knee when the knock came. It wasn't a friendly knock. It wasn't a neighborly, "Can I borrow a cup of sugar?" knock. It was a cop knock. Hard, sharp, and impatient. Bam, bam, bam. The sound sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear through her. Bam, bam, bam. "Ms. Jenkins, LPD, open the door!" She struggled to her feet, the sudden movement sending a cascade of white-hot pain up her arms. I'm coming," she called out, her voice shaky. It took her almost a full minute to get to the door and fumble with the deadbolt. Her bandaged hands were useless. She finally had to turn her back to the door and use her hip and elbow to twist the lock. She pulled the door open. Two men stood in the hallway, their presence seeming to suck all the air out of the space. The first was Officer Grant, the young, terrified cop from the overpass. He was in his full pressed uniform, but he looked smaller, diminished. He stared at a spot on the carpet, pointedly not meeting her eyes. The second man was the one in charge. He was in a crisp, dark suit that looked more like a uniform than a civilian outfit. He had a military short haircut, a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite, and cold steel gray eyes that assessed, measured, and dismissed her all in one glance. "Ms. Sarah Jenkins?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, can I help you?" "Lieutenant Marks, Internal Affairs," the man said, flipping open a badge. "This is Officer Grant. We need to ask you a few questions about the incident on the 10th. May we come in?" He didn't wait for an answer, brushing past her into the living room. Officer Grant followed, a silent, ashamed shadow. Marks's eyes swept the room. The bottles of pills on the coffee table, the stained saline basin, the pillows propping up her arms. He seemed to take it all in as evidence of her dysfunction. "Please sit," Sarah said, gesturing with her bandaged arms. Marks remained standing. He pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and clicked it on. "This is Lieutenant Marks conducting a formal, recorded interview with Ms. Sarah Jenkins. The time is 14:30. Officer Grant is also present. Now, Ms. Jenkins, let's go over the events of that night." The next hour was the most surreal and terrifying of her life. This was not an interview. It was an interrogation. "So," Marks began, his voice a dispassionate monotone, "you were operating a motor vehicle on the 91 West overpass." "Yes." "And you witnessed a police pursuit." "Yes, I did." "And you stopped your vehicle in a live lane of traffic and exited." The cruiser had crashed. It was on fire. Marks looked at his notes. Officer Grant arrived on scene and identified himself as law enforcement. He looked at Grant. "Is that correct, officer?" Grant swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, sir. I told her to get back, that it was going to blow." Marks's cold eyes fixed on Sarah. "So, you heard a uniformed police officer give you a direct lawful order to stay back for your own safety and the integrity of the scene?" "He was trapped," Sarah said, her voice rising. "He would have died. The car exploded less than a minute after I pulled him out." Marks held up a hand. "Please, Ms. Jenkins, let's stick to the facts. You, a civilian with no authority, chose to ignore a lawful order." "I'm a nurse," she said, the words a desperate plea. I'm a trained medical professional. I have a duty to render aid." "A duty?" Marks said, tasting the word with disgust. "Your duty is to not interfere with a police investigation. Your duty is to not get in the way." "Officer Grant, what was your status when Ms. Jenkins interfered?" Grant looked miserable. Sir, I was attempting to secure the primary suspect vehicle, which had fled while also cordoning off the scene and calling for backup. So, Mark said, turning back to Sarah, his voice dropping. You had a uniformed officer alone on a dangerous scene who now had to divide his attention between a fleeing felon, a burning car, and you. A hysterical civilian who, by all accounts, was climbing into the vehicle. I wasn't hysterical, Sarah said, the injustice of it making her shake. I was saving him. Were you? Marks took a step closer. Or were you endangering him further? Are you a spinal specialist, Ms. Jenkins? Did you, in your professional capacity, perform a C-spine check before you saved him? Before you dragged him from the vehicle and saved him right into a life of being a quadriplegic? Sarah's blood ran cold. What? Is he paralyzed? No, Mark snapped. He's not. He's got a broken clavicle and 3 cracked ribs. He got lucky. You got lucky. You had no business touching him. What if you'd moved him and severed his spinal cord? What then, nurse? This was the ultimate calculated insult. He was using her own training, her own code of ethics against her. He was twisting her life-saving act into an act of profound criminal negligence. I did a quick assessment, she stammered. The car was on fire. There was no time. It was a load-and-go situation. Life over limb. The jargon, Mark sneered. Here's some more jargon for you. Contamination of a crime scene. Obstruction of justice. Interfering with a police officer. He paced in front of her like a shark. You see, Ms. Jenkins, we have a problem. The suspect in the black sedan, the one who caused all this. His lawyer is already claiming police misconduct. He's claiming Officer Kincaid rammed him. And the only civilian witness we have is you. A witness who contaminated the scene. A witness who has an ambiguous relationship with the LPD. A witness who, by climbing into the vehicle, may have destroyed crucial evidence. Sarah just stared at him, her mind reeling. He was painting her as a scapegoat. He rammed Officer Kincaid, she whispered. I saw it. He T-boned him. Did you? Mark smiled, a thin, cruel expression. Or were you just a hysterical civilian who couldn't possibly know what she saw? Your testimony is compromised, tainted by your actions. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of her. You think you're a hero, don't you, Ms. Jenkins? You think you're special. You're just another civilian who thinks they know better than us. You made our job harder. You put Officer Grant at risk. You potentially compromised a felony investigation, and you almost got yourself and Officer Kincaid killed. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. So here's what's going to happen. You are going to keep your mouth shut. You're not going to talk to any reporters. You're not going to tell your story, because if you do, I will find a way to make these charges stick. Obstruction is a very broad, very useful statute. Am I clear? Sarah was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. Good. Marks straightened his suit. We're done here. He turned to the door. Grant. Officer Grant, who had not said a single word, finally looked at her. His face was a mask of shame and self-loathing. Sir, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sir, she did save him. I was frozen. She... Marks's head snapped around. His eyes were chips of ice. You're done, Grant. Get in the car. Yes, sir. Grant's face crumpled. He turned and fled the apartment. Marks gave Sarah one last lingering look. A look of pure, unadulterated contempt. Have a nice day, Ms. Jenkins. Try not to save anyone else on your way to the store. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sounding as final as a prison cell door. Sarah stood in the middle of her living room for a long time. Then, her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the couch, the movement sending spikes of agony up her arms. But the physical pain was nothing. It was a dull, distant echo compared to the new, icy cold terror that had just settled in her heart. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a nurse. She was a suspect. The world, it turned out, could get much, much smaller. After Lieutenant Marks's visit, Sarah's apartment ceased to be a prison and became something worse, a bunker. She drew the curtains, blocking out the sunlight that seemed to mock her. She unplugged her landline and let her cell phone die. Every car that slowed down on her street, every footstep in the hall sent a fresh jolt of paranoid terror through her. The silence was a thick, heavy blanket, broken only by the hiss of her own shallow breathing. The painkillers, the ones Ben had forgotten in a sample bag, were running low. She started to ration them, cutting the pills in half, then in quarters. But that just invited the pain back in, a tide of fire that lapped at the edges of her consciousness. Worse than the pain, though, was the fear. Marks had done his job well. She felt like a criminal. She saw herself through his eyes, a reckless, hysterical, stupid woman who had blundered into a man's world and made a mess of everything. And then the public humiliation began. It wasn't a front-page story. It was a small, 3-paragraph article on page A12 of the city newspaper, buried between a hardware store ad and a story about a lost cat. Her neighbor, an elderly woman who watered her plants, had clipped it and slid it under her door. Sarah had stared at it, her vision blurry, until the words swam into focus. Off-duty nurse injured after interfering in police chase. Interfering, the word hit her like a slap. An off-duty nurse from St. Jude's Hospital, the article read, is recovering from injuries sustained after interfering in a police pursuit on the 91 West overpass late Tuesday. The nurse, whose name has not been released, reportedly ignored a direct order from an officer on the scene and contaminated a developing crime scene, according to an LPD source. An LPD source. Marks. The actions of the nurse are currently under review, according to a spokesperson from St. Jude's, who stated that the nurse was acting as a private citizen and not as a representative of the hospital. A hospital spokesperson, Davies. They had done it. They had controlled the narrative. They had painted her as a rogue, a problem, a meddler. There was no mention of a rescue, no mention of Officer Kincaid, no mention that the car had exploded moments later. Just a few carefully chosen words that turned her from a hero into a liability. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating weight in her chest. Then the bills started. The first one came in a crisp, white envelope from St. Jude's billing department. She stared at the return address, her hospital, her workplace. She managed to tear it open with her teeth in her one less damaged right hand. It was an itemized bill for her time in the ER. The trauma bay fee, the IV bags, the morphine, the bandages, Dr. Carter's time. The total at the bottom was $14,382. At the top, in a cold blue computer font, was a note. Ref, patient status. Unpaid administrative leave, not eligible for staff discount or workman's comp. Full payment due in 30 days. She laughed. It was a raw, dry barking sound that scared her. $14,000. She had maybe $2,000 in her savings. Her last paycheck, the one she was due this week, would be held thanks to Davies. She was unemployed. She was in agony. And now she was in debt. She was at a new, lower level of hell she hadn't known existed. Her days devolved into a meaningless, painful loop. Wake up, stare at the ceiling, force herself to do the agonizing bandage-changing ritual, a process that left her shaking and weeping. Try to eat a piece of dry toast, watch the dust motes dance in the slivers of light that pierced her curtains, go back to sleep. The physical therapy, the only thing that kept her tethered to a future, was its own special torture. She had to force her hands to bend. The specialist, a kind woman Ben had referred her to, had given her a set of rubber balls and putty. The scar tissue is setting in, the therapist had said gently. If you don't break it up now, Sarah, you'll never regain full mobility. You have to push through the pain. You have to make them bleed if you have to. So she tried. She sat on her couch, a rolled-up towel in her mouth to bite down on, and pushed. She tried to make a fist. The skin on her forearms, tight and shiny and puckered, felt like it was ripping open. The pain was a 10 out of 10, a fresh electric agony. Tears streamed down her face, but she pushed. Because if she couldn't make a fist, she could never hold a syringe. She could never start an IV. She could never be a nurse again. She was failing. Her fingers would only curl halfway before the pain became a whiteout, a void that threatened to swallow her. This was her darkest morning. It was a week after the incident. The painkillers were gone. The money was gone. Her job was gone. Her hope was gone. She sat in her dark living room, her bandaged, useless hands resting in her lap. They were monuments to her stupidity. She looked at the bottle of pills on her counter. Not painkillers, sleeping pills, left over from a bout of insomnia last year. There were enough. They were right. The thought landed with a cold, quiet finality. Davies. Marks? They were right. She was a fool, a reckless, arrogant, emotional fool. She had broken the rules. She had interfered, and this was her punishment. This was the cost of playing hero. She should have just driven by. She should have listened to Officer Grant. She should have stayed in her car, locked her doors, and let the professionals handle it. She should have let that man burn. She looked at her hands, the hands that had saved him. They were the source of all her pain. They were the instruments of her ruin. She let her head fall back against the couch cushions, the tears finally coming. Not hot tears of rage, but cold, quiet tears of absolute, profound despair. She was broken. They had won. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there. The transition from despair to a hollow, empty numbness had been mercifully quick. She was just gone. A ghost in her own apartment. It was the sound that brought her back. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration. A low, deep thrumming that she felt in the floorboards, in her teeth. It was like a truck, but more, deeper. It was the sound of power. It grew, a subterranean rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It rattled the cheap glass in her window frames. Vroom. It stopped, idling, right outside her apartment. What now? She thought, a flash of the old, familiar terror returning. Is it Marks? Are they here to arrest me? She dragged herself off the couch, her body aching. She crept to the window and with her less damaged hand carefully, fearfully, parted the edge of the curtain, and the world outside her window made no sense. Her small, quiet residential street, usually home to a few parked sedans and a stray cat, was gone. In its place was a thing. It was massive, black, and angular. It looked like something from a war zone, not a suburb. It was a Bearcat, a Lenko armored tactical vehicle. It was parked directly in front of her walkway, its enormous, reinforced steel bulk taking up the entire road. Its engine was idling, that deep, gut-vibrating rumble. And that wasn't all. Lined up on her small, patchy lawn, standing in perfect silent formation, were 12 men. They were not cops, not in the way she understood. They were operators. They were dressed in head-to-toe black tactical gear. Ballistic helmets, an arsenal of equipment strapped to their chests, rifles slung, though not pointed. They were anonymous, terrifying, and utterly, profoundly still. They stood in two perfect ranks, facing her apartment, unmoving. Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs. What is this? What have I done? Just as her mind was trying to process the sheer, intimidating unreality of it, two cars pulled up, screeching to a halt behind the Bearcat. They were civilian cars, a black sedan and a beige sedan. Out of the beige sedan stepped Mr. Davies. He looked ruffled, his perfect suit somehow cheap and rumpled in the presence of the black-clad operators. He was gaping at the Bearcat, his face a mask of confusion. Out of the black sedan stepped Lieutenant Marks. He, too, was out of his element. His authority was a cheap imitation next to the silent, deadly presence of the men on her lawn. He looked angry and a little scared. They had clearly been summoned. A new figure emerged, stepping out from behind the Bearcat. He was not in full gear, but in a black utility uniform. He was older, with a face that looked like it had been carved from oak and a head of iron-gray, close-cropped hair. He had an eagle, a globe, and an anchor tattooed on his forearm. He was, without a doubt, the man in charge. His name tag read Thorne. He didn't look at Davies or Marks. He walked to the center of the lawn and faced Sarah's front door. He just stood there, waiting. Sarah, her hand still on the curtain, felt a strange new feeling. The fear was still there, but it was being crowded out. She let the curtain fall. She looked at her bandaged hands. She looked at the floor, and then she did the hardest thing she'd done all week. She walked to the door. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking, but this time it was from adrenaline, not despair. She opened the door. She stood in the doorway, a small, pale figure in a ratty bathrobe, her arms wrapped in stained white gauze. The 12 men on her lawn didn't move. Commander Thorne's eyes found hers. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a slight, respectful dip of his chin. Davies and Marks were now walking up the driveway, their voices a low, angry buzz. "Commander Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" Marks demanded, trying to reclaim his authority. "This is an active situation. You have no jurisdiction." "Shut up, Lieutenant," Thorne said, not even looking at him. His voice was gravel. It was the sound of command. Marks, to his credit, actually shut up. Thorne turned his gaze to Davies. "You're the hospital man?" "I'm Administrator Davies, yes, and this is highly irregular." "You," Thorne said, "and you," he said, flicking his gaze to Marks, "are going to stand there, and you are going to be quiet." He turned back to face the door, to face Sarah. He took a deep breath, and his voice, which had been a low rumble, became a bark that echoed in the quiet morning air, a sound that snapped the entire street to attention. "Attention!" The 12 men, as one, snapped their heels together, their bodies rigid. The sound of it was like a rifle shot. They turned in perfect, drilled unison to face Sarah. "Ms. Jenkins," Thorne's voice boomed. And then, in one sharp, unified motion, all 12 operators and Commander Thorne raised their hands to their brows. A perfect, formal, military salute. They just held it. Silent. Still. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Thorne, his hand still at his brow, began to speak. His eyes were locked on hers. "Ms. Jenkins, the man you pulled from that fire, Officer Kincaid, is our brother. He is a breacher on our team. He is alive today. His kids have a father today. Because you, unarmed, with no gear, and in defiance of protocol, did what you were sworn to do." He held her gaze. "You ran towards the danger." Then he turned his head, a slight, terrifying motion. His eyes bored into Lieutenant Marks. "We don't salute protocol, Lieutenant," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We salute honor." He turned his head to Mr. Davies, who had gone the color of spoiled milk. "And we don't salute budgets, Mr. Davies. We salute courage." He turned his gaze back to Sarah, his expression softening, just for a second. "The LPD SWAT team and the family of Officer Frank Kincaid thank you. You are and always will be one of us." He held the salute for 10 more seconds. 10 full, silent, agonizing seconds. The only sound was the click, click, click of a neighbor's cell phone camera from across the street. Davies and Marks were frozen, publicly, utterly, and devastatingly humiliated. Their petty, bureaucratic power had evaporated in the face of this raw, absolute, and moral judgment. "Dismissed," Thorne barked. The team dropped their salutes as one. They turned and, in perfect order, filed back into the Bearcat. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Thorne was the last to leave. He walked back to his truck, but paused and looked at Sarah one last time. He just nodded. Then he got in, and the rumble started again. The Bearcat and its entourage pulled away, leaving a stunned, silent street, and 2 very small, very pale men standing on a patchy lawn. Sarah just stood in her doorway, the cool morning air on her face, and for the first time in a week, she let herself cry. This time, they were not tears of pain. The salute on the lawn video, as the neighbor's cell phone footage came to be known, did not stay on one neighbor's phone. By noon, it was on the local news. By 6 p.m., it was on the national news. By the next morning, it was everywhere. The narrative, which Davies and Marks had so carefully controlled, was not just rewritten. It was violently and publicly obliterated. The fallout was immediate. The hospital's board of directors, facing a PR firestorm and a flood of angry calls from the police union, convened an emergency meeting. Mr. Davies was given a choice: resign or be fired. He was cleaning out his desk by 5 o'clock, his citrusy cologne a fading, bitter memory in the halls of St. Jude's. Lieutenant Marks was reassigned to a position where he could do no more harm, the evidence locker in the basement of the downtown precinct, a career-ending move known as retiring in place. But for Sarah, the fight wasn't over. Her hands were still her hands, the recovery was still long, the physical therapy was still agony. But now she was not alone. The SWAT team had, as Commander Thorne had declared, made her one of us. This was a tribe that did not let its own fall. The Police Benevolent Fund, strongly encouraged by Thorne, quietly paid her $14,382.50 hospital bill and covered all her future medical expenses. The families of the team adopted her. When her water heater broke, two quiet, burly men just showed up and replaced it. When she had a physical therapy appointment, there was always a SWAT wife waiting in a minivan to drive her. The first visitor she allowed was Officer Kincaid. He was in a wheelchair, his arm in a sling, his ribs taped, but his eyes were bright. His wife stood behind him, and his two young children, a boy and a girl, hid behind her legs. They told me what you did, Kincaid said, his voice thick. They said you climbed in. I'm a nurse, Sarah said, the first time she'd used the words without a sting. It's what we do. Kincaid's wife burst into tears. You saved my family, she whispered. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of her mirror. She was wearing her scrubs. They were new, clean. She looked at her hands. They were different. The skin was a puckered, silver and pink roadmap of her ordeal. They were not pretty. They were scars. But for the first time, she saw them not as marks of her ruin, but as a badge. She walked through the pneumatic whoosh of the St. Jude's ER doors. The smell of bleach and coffee welcomed her home. The new administrator, a no-nonsense woman who was a former ER nurse herself, was there. She just nodded and pointed to a chart. Sarah picked it up. She felt the familiar, comforting weight of it in her hands. Then she noticed the silence. The beeps and groans of the ER were gone. It was quiet. She looked up. Every nurse, every doctor, every orderly, every tech, they had all stopped. They were all looking at her. Dr. Ben Carter, a huge, goofy grin on his face, started to clap. Slowly, at first, and then, all at once, the ER erupted in applause. It wasn't for a hero, it was for their nurse. It was for Sarah. She felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She nodded once, a small, grateful gesture. The fire inside her, the one that had been agony and then despair, had finally settled. It was no longer a fire that burned. It was a fire that warmed. All right, she said, her voice a little shaky, but full of its old, familiar authority. Who's in Bay 3? What are his vitals? She clipped the chart to her board and got to work.